This video is about my experience at the US border in 2022. I've spoken about it quite a lot before, but I still get messages asking if I'm planning on going to the US anytime soon. So I'm filming another video about what happened and trying to explain why I'm unable to visit the US anytime soon. Officially, not until 2032, because it was a 10-year ban, but realistically forever, unless the laws change in some way. I first spoke about it just a few days after I got back in a reel. And then last year, I wrote an article for Trist about it, which is what I'll be reading out here. Since this happened, and even since I wrote the article, the context has changed because even aside from being a sex worker, I would not feel comfortable visiting the US right now for what I assume are obvious reasons, but just in case, terrifying detentions at the border, the fascistic surveillance of anyone trying to enter, the racism and xenophobia once you're in, which might not affect me personally, but which I don't want anything to do with, and the risk of being flagged as trans and having even more issues. Obviously, the UK, we have our own problems, so I'm not trying to make it sound as if everything's great here, because it is definitely not. But those are the reasons I wouldn't feel comfortable facing similar issues, but in a different country as well. In other words, when this happened to me almost 3 years ago, it was a situation that the majority of people would not have to contend with. I don't want to say it was unique to sex workers even then, because the US border has always been notoriously hostile to non-white people, Muslims, and so on. But I think it's clear that the range of people being targeted has significantly expanded since then, as have the reasons for targeting people. So I therefore say that my experience can be read in a different context now, some of which I do cover in the article, but which wasn't clear from the first video I made about what happened. I just wanted to add that caveat or introduction before I go into what actually happened. So in September 2022, I traveled to Atlanta. My plan was to stay there for about a week, visiting my aunt and uncle, and then fly to New York for another week and stay with friends. I arrived at the airport after the 9-hour flight, queued up at passport control, and was called to the booth. They took my fingerprints, scanned my passport, and took my picture. I waited to be allowed through. The officer glanced at me and then spoke into the speaker, "Officer escort to booth 9. From where I was standing, I could see her computer screen, which read, "Refer to immigration." Next to my picture, it said, "Suspected to be part of a multinational escort ring advertising on rent men." There were other comments and alerts that I couldn't see. At that, I obviously started to panic. An officer led me to a waiting room, which was a locked room with mirrored walls, so the officers at the desk outside could see in, but we couldn't see out. There were about 20 of us in the room, including families with children, and occasionally a guard would appear at the door and summon someone. I waited there for an hour before being interviewed, feeling partly terrified and partly just resigning myself to the situation and trying not to worry too much. Since I'd already seen the information they held on me, I didn't deny having done sex work in the past. The officer I spoke to wasn't unkind, which in my anxious state I appreciated, but with more distance I'm cynical about these friendly faces of authority and punishment. She told me that my past escorting made me ineligible for the ESTA visa I had travelled with, and that I would be sent back to the UK. It's not clear how I was flagged. It may have been facial recognition, because I later overheard two officers talking about how Atlanta was among the first airports in the US to have new facial recognition software. Or it may be that rent men had sold or been forced to hand over personal details about anyone advertising on their site. This crackdown on online advertising platforms is part of the US Foster-Sester bills, ostensibly aimed at increasing online safety and protecting victims of sex trafficking. These draconian laws actually lead to more harm, as sex workers are forced onto the streets instead of advertising and negotiating with clients online, as well as removing spaces for workers to share information about dangerous clients or safer working practices. The lack of transparency around the methods used to trap people at the border causes stress and fear, as well as enabling border control to stop anyone with little evidence, for example, if they're traveling with sex toys or if they have nude photos on their phone. Although many workers do not show their face online, sharing passport details or other ID documents is unavoidable, as most advertising sites require them for proof of age. This means that traveling to the US is a gamble for anyone who has ever engaged in any kind of sex work, as the rules seem to be applied inconsistently and unpredictably. On a personal level, it's bizarre and anxiety inducing that I still don't know why they stopped me or what information they have about me. Later, I was taken to a small interview room and asked further questions, including basic personal details and information about my sex working history. I do porn as well as full service work, but I wasn't asked about that. The questions were not about whether I intended to work in the US. They asked this once, but my visa was revoked regardless. When I spoke about the experience on social media afterwards, I was criticized for expecting to be allowed to enter without a work visa, but I wasn't denied entry on that basis. US law states that anyone who is engaged in prostitution within the last 10 years will be denied entry, even as in my case, where the activities are legal in the individual's own country. Several of the questions asked at this point focused on sex trafficking. Are you being coerced? Do you have any fears about being sent back to your own country? In a way, these questions felt like a method of sidestepping any accusations of cruelty or unfairness towards sex workers by saying, we're just doing it to help victims of sex trafficking. The issue is that trafficking is used as an umbrella term to encompass a wide range of things. As Molly Smith and Juno Mack write in Revolting Prostitutes, an amazing book that I would recommend to everyone, focusing just on commercial sex, some people use trafficking to mean all prostitution or all migration to the sex industry. Others mean all migration into the sex industry that involves help from a third party, even if that third party is not seeking financial gain, for instance, a friend or relative. It might cover anyone who incurs debt in the process of crossing borders without papers, or who incurs such a debt and pays that debt off through sex work. This deliberately loose definition of sex trafficking, including everything from organized crime to simply arranging travel or a hotel for a sex worker friend, criminalizes sex workers and puts us at further risk of harm. The lack of workers' rights, especially for migrants and other undocumented workers, is at the root of this. Sex workers classified by authorities as victims of sex trafficking and, more broadly, human trafficking, are often simply people escaping danger in their home country. Many end up in dependent and coercive relationships at work, for example, with a tied visa, preventing migrants from changing employers, which means they are at risk of deportation if they speak up about unfair or abusive working environments. It's easy to see then how punitive anti-immigration measures produce vulnerability and harm. Workers in these situations are far more likely to go into sex work out of a lack of other options. Laid out in this way, it's clear that sex work itself is not to blame, but rather the poor living and working conditions that leave vulnerable people with few other options. Instead of cracking down on a misguided definition of sex trafficking, the solution is to remove barriers to better working conditions, to help people out of poverty, to enable them to escape dangerous situations, and to open up more options and opportunities. Criminalizing sex workers does none of this. It leaves us with a criminal record, little other support or routes out, children taken away from their parents, partners implicated, and our privacy violated. The laws penalizing sex workers also trap us. If we receive fines, we need to work to pay them off. If we have a criminal record, we will struggle to find alternative employment. As Ruth Wilson Gilmore writes on prisons, although the principle is the same, abolition is not absence, it is presence. Instead of simply removing something, whether that's the prison system or borders, abolition focuses on introducing new and strengthening existing safety nets and support systems for people being persecuted by existing regimes. I'm sure after I was deported, the authorities at border control could tick a box to say that another case of sex trafficking was avoided, regardless of what answers I gave to their questions. I wonder what support and aid would have been offered had I said I was being coerced into traveling to the US, that I was being trafficked. Would they have helped me? Would I still have been sent back to the country they implied I was escaping from? After this interview, I was told that all flights back to the UK had left, so I would be held overnight. It was around 10 p.m. US time, so 3 a.m. UK time. I hadn't slept in 24 hours. They told me I would have a private room to sleep, rather than in the waiting room as I thought, and naively I pictured a bed and a pillow and a duvet and somewhere to charge my phone. Instead, I was put in a cell with an armchair, an airline blanket, no clock, the lights on constantly, and a toilet in the corner. My phone, earrings, and shoelaces were taken away. In my sleep-deprived state, I didn't think to let my family know I would be uncontactable for 16 hours. They knew I'd been stopped and questioned, but I hadn't updated them since then. The next morning, I was given a cup of coffee and a cup of instant noodles, and I spent the day doing light exercises in the cell and reading the few books I've been allowed to keep once they flicked through to check nothing was hidden inside. In the evening, around 5 p.m. US time, I was finally led from the cell and put on a flight. Until that moment, I hadn't been able to relax. I'd been scared throughout and I just wanted to go home. They'd told me I had a plane ticket, but until I was sitting down and in the air, I felt on edge, as if anything might happen to make them change their mind and detain me further. Although I was technically banned for 10 years, since the ESTA rule states that you're ineligible if you've done sex work at all in the past 10 years, for me, it's essentially a rolling ban, since I'm still a sex worker and I have no intention of switching careers anytime soon. The border control officer did say I could apply for a visa waiver if I wanted, which would involve going to an embassy in person, but I think the chances of being approved for that are very slim, and the experience was scary enough that I'm discouraged from trying at all. Since I've been back, I've heard about the same thing happening to other sex workers and ex sex workers and those who were incorrectly classified as sex workers based on border control's subjective and prejudiced perceptions of them. Like me, most of them have no clear idea about how or why they were flagged and have no realistic recourse to challenge the decision. In the moment, the whole ordeal was pretty traumatic. I was treated like a criminal, which felt dehumanizing and unjust. After I got back home, I was just happy to be done with it. Though I felt some sadness over the missed trip and cancelled plans, the sense of relief I felt was the overriding feeling at the time. Since then, I've noticed more lasting effects, like pervading anxiety around authority and surveillance. As a sex worker, I've always been somewhat aware of the persecution we face, but naively, I don't think I really expected to be stopped at the border. I didn't expect this to happen to me. What happened was a stark wake up call and a reminder how difficult it is to escape. That even following the law and trying to do everything correctly does not guarantee safety. Despite the ostensible intentions behind these laws and restrictions, supposedly aimed at protecting victims and keeping people safe, the safety and well-being of sex workers ourselves are never considered, and the varied and often abstruse methods of persecution we face as sex workers can infiltrate all aspects of our lives. Clearly, the laws themselves are the problem, and full decriminalisation of sex work is the only solution. Thank you for watching. I hope it was informative.